Determined budget is a planning process that occurs in the cost knowledge area. Determined budget follows estimate costs, and what we're doing here is basically taking those cost estimates and essentially doing two or three things here. We are allocating those costs across the work breakdown structure to essentially create a cost breakdown structure, and we are taking the schedule and applying the cost to the activity. So we're looking at the time phased application of money from start to finish, and then ultimately, some might say beginning, but ultimately knowing what the total cost of the project would be as well, meaning we might just add everything up, know what it is, or we could create the cost breakdown structure, apply it to the schedule, and then as a result know what the total project costs are expected to be. So it's not just the total of the cost, but how the costs divide across the work of the project and the time phased part of the schedule. Now, when we think about the ITO tables here, starting out we have our cost management plan, which tells us how to do what I just described. Basically, how to get those cost estimates distributed throughout the work breakdown structure and across the schedule, and ultimately add things up. The scope baseline is going to be used in part to get the dollar amounts allocated across those work packages and higher level parts of your work breakdown structure. The basis of estimates, if applicable, or if necessary, I guess we could definitely say it's applicable, but would it always be necessary? But the basis of estimates could be used here if there was some conflict or some clarification needed or something to that effect as far as what pieces of work are expected to cost, etc. Cost estimates are an input because that's what we're taking and working with here. You know, that's where we're getting it across the WBS, the schedule, etc. So my schedule is an input, so activity by activity by activity, I'm getting a feel for what the pieces of the work cost and then the timing that we expect to need money. The risk register is a key input, so we can look for things to go, well, not look for things to go, but things that could go differently than planned here. Think about it this way. If history showed, and we've got a tool and technique associated with that as well, but if history showed that when requirements were a bear, testing was a bear. Well, if you were having a hard time getting your arms around the requirements, I would assume you might have some risks in your risk register about testing as far as uncertainty associated with it. Now, agreements is a key input if you're outsourcing something to a vendor or vendors, because you can look at the agreements and see the timing of when you expect work to cost money and how much you expect. And there might be kind of unique parameters in the agreement which can influence things. When I worked at Motorola and we rolled out the first, or one of the first, if not the first, digital cellular networks in the United States, our network had to run, I think they said, for 40 days without a certain severity of error before we got paid. And every time there was a severity of error that big or bigger, the clock started over again. So that agreement influenced, I guess you'd say, budget, funding, etc., as an example. Now, expert judgment we've seen as a tool and technique in a lot of cases here. In this case, it is basically used to make sure that we feel comfortable about how we're dividing the money across the work packages and the higher level pieces of the WBS, and then also how we're applying the timing of things as well. You know, in other words, do things look practical and realistic? Now, cost aggregation is where you roll those activities up into the work packages as far as costs, those work packages up to planning packages, and then up to your higher level WBS pieces, so you can get a feel for what you expect the project to totally cost. Reserve analysis. Again, analysis is always a tool and technique. Do you expect that you've got reserve to be able to finish things as needed? You know, if you think about it, some people really freak out toward the end of a project. You know, like, I'm running out of time, I'm running out of money. Okay, here's the deal. The plan was on the final day of the project, you were going to be out of time and out of money, and the work was going to be done. So, you know, you can do reserve analysis at any point along the way and see if you're on pace to be able to finish things the way you expect financially or not. Now, from there, we get into historical information review. So, like I said earlier, with reviewing, for example, requirements and testing, if there's a strong correlation between them. If this project had some issues with requirements, you probably want to set aside some extra money for testing if that's a historical pattern you've seen. And then funding limit reconciliation. You know, when I think about this, I think about a bunch of little buckets of money where if you add all the money up, it totals the expected cost of the project. And if one bucket of work gets done cheaper than all the money that was set aside for that, then basically you're balancing that, and that money can go back to, as one job I was at called it, a funding pool. And then maybe that money could go to another account on the project if necessary. Say it was running over budget, for example. Now the cost baseline is a key, huge output here. If you're trying to do earned value, which is going to be in a couple of our standalone videos, I think if I remember right, or one where we discuss it, the other where we do it, you are not going to be able to do earned value if you don't have a cost baseline, because that's going to show you the time phased from start to finish of the project that you expect to spend money. In other words, you expect to get work done, thus you should spend money in relation to that. And just because you're halfway through the project, it doesn't mean you should have the work half done. Just because you spent half the budget, it doesn't mean half the work is done. So this cost baseline, among other things, is going to be a total dollar amount for the project, or total currency amount. It's going to be a time-phased application from start to finish at any slice in time of how much money you should have gone through, aka how much work should be done, etc. So then the project funding requirements. What's the rate at which you need money? Is it you need $1 million up front and $100,000 a month after that? Do you need $100,000 up front and $1 million a month after that? Do you need it all now? What does it look like? And that's where that cost baseline comes into play with that S-curve. You can look at the shape of it, and at slices in time, you should be able to basically know how much you need. Situational question and real-world application. Failure to effectively execute the determined budget process is likely to result in cost overruns. An alternate possibility is that the project could be delayed due to a lack of funds needed to acquire equipment or materials necessary for the project. Now, when we think about chart of accounts, some of you guys maybe have used Quicken or Microsoft Money when it was around or something like that. The categories that we use there in setting up a household budget, that's basically the chart of accounts as it relates to the project. So in this context, the chart of accounts would be a subset of the project's, or I should say the company's, accounting structure. So the project chart of accounts is going to be a subset of the company's chart of accounts with their overall accounting structure. So basically, like when I was at a telecom company once, we had a list of accounts. We could basically check things out, so to speak. We could allocate it to us. We could put money in it, and then we would basically tell people, if you're doing this, bill against this account, that, bill against that account. And that's those little buckets that I was referencing earlier in this video, all those little buckets adding up to the total cost of the project. Now, when we think about code of accounts, that's the numbering structure. So 2.3.2.5.17.4. I feel like going hut hut like I'm a football quarterback when I say things like that. But basically, that numbering scheme lets you see where the work fits in the work breakdown structure and then how deep it is as well.